The big advantage of the export-oriented industrialization strategy that a wave of countries pursued, Japan in the 50s and 60s, and South Korea, Taiwan in the 60s and 70s, and of course, ultimately, most successfully, China since the 1990s, is that manufacturing, especially export-oriented manufacturing, can be a very powerful engine for growth. But unfortunately, I think that the world has changed significantly, the world economy, and the possibilities of significant and rapid industrialization in the latecomers, like the sub-Saharan African countries, are now much, much more limited. For one thing, there's much more international competition, so it's harder to get a beachhead. Once you have had a China there, it's really getting very hard for and there's much less natural or man-made protection in the system. So it's much harder for countries in Africa to develop sort of beachheads or niches in manufacturing. Secondly, perhaps more fundamentally, now manufacturing and global value chains have become extremely skill intensive, much more so than they were 30, 40 years ago. So even very labor abundant countries are finding it very difficult to put a lot of workers into manufacturing. And so we're not going to be getting these kinds of manufacturing-led growth experiences, and the experience of even relatively more successful industrializing countries in Africa like Ethiopia shows that the growth is not coming out of manufacturing. You just have to, you don't have the luxury of waiting until you've been able to skill up all your workforce. So the tough challenge is to create relatively productive jobs with the workforce that you have, with the skills they have, and not with the skills you hope they will have, 2 generations later. And that, I think, is a question to which, frankly, I don't think anyone has a very, very good answer. I think, certainly at the margin, there is some room still for industrialization because these countries are starting from some such low levels. So at the margin, there is some possibilities there. I think these countries have to look much more at sort of a kind of mid-range, typically non-tradable services, and expand employment in sort of more modern kinds of services, because that's services is effectively what's going to be where the labor will have to go in the urban areas. And many of them also have a lot of opportunities in sort of non-traditional modern agriculture with, improvements in yields and productivity are actually, quite a bit possible. So it'll have to be much more of a diversified strategy rather than simply relying on a few exports at a time. You'll have to rely much less on manufacturing than it did before. It has to be much more domestic market oriented and less export oriented, because that's not just going to create the kinds of jobs you want. And it'll have to be much more focused, because it's sort of domestic market focused. It'll have to be focusing much more on sort of creating kind of a middle class economy that can generate demand for, that can grow the domestic market for domestic producers. So these are some broad, changes in orientation, but how to make these operational through specific policies is something that I think we still don't know very well.